Welcome, everyone. My name is Erin Olszewski. I am the Program Director with Sustainable Agriculture and Food Systems Funders, also known by our acronym SAFSF. So welcome to today's webinar, Opportunities in Good Food Purchasing, Learning from Leaders in the Fields. Today's webinar is co-hosted with the 11th Hour Project and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. So thank you to our two funder planning partners. And this webinar is part 2 of a 2-part series on good food purchasing. The first webinar that we hosted in March was focused on learning from fellow peer funders about the power of this work. And during that call, we delved into the history, the landscape of good food purchasing work from the perspective of funders in our network. We showcase its potential for systemic change and the myriad of avenues for funders to get involved. Today, we're going to hear from a panel of field leaders who will share triumphs and hurdles encountered in their work, as well as illuminating distinct opportunities for funders to deepen their involvement in advancing good food purchasing initiatives. So thank you for being here today. Thank you for your interest. And if you haven't already, please introduce yourself in the chat. It's always helpful to get a sense of who's on the call today. So for those of you who might be newer to SAFSF, I'd like to share a little bit about us and who we are before we get started in today's call. SAFSF is a national membership network of philanthropic and impact investment organizations who care about creating just and sustainable agriculture and food systems. Our members and partners are comprised of private and endowed foundations, public charities, impact investment firms, community development financial institutions, or CDFIs, and regranting organizations who seek to move mission-driven capital in more collective, strategic, and impactful ways in partnership with frontline communities, movement leaders, and nonprofit organizations who are implementing change on the ground. We ourselves are a nonprofit with more than 100 members across the country, working at both national, state, tribal, and local levels. So with all that being said, I'd like to now turn it over to Sarah Bell. Sarah is the Program Director at the 11th Hour Project and is one of our funder planning partners for today's webinar. Sarah is going to share a little bit more about our agenda and our plan for today's call. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Sarah. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Erin. Hi, everyone. It's really great to see you all. We have an incredible group of participants and an incredible group of experts and practitioners to hear from. As Erin said, I'm Sarah Bell at the 11th Hour Project, and Erin's just given context for the previous meeting, and so I won't go more into that because I want to really leave time for this fantastic conversation and also Q&A. But as far as connecting around thinking about what's going to be the overall flow of today, I am really thrilled that Roger Cooley, who is the executive director of the Chicago Food Policy Action Council, agreed to moderate this conversation, as well as bring his perspective as a key actor locally in the work around good food purchasing and values-based procurement. So Roger, as far as the agenda, is going to talk with each of our panelists and also offer up some questions. And then we will open it up for Q&A from the audience. And then Linda Jo is going to close us out. And I would invite you, since we have such a large group, I think, Erin, we're going to take the questions via the chat. So as they come up, please put them into the chat, and we will make sure and get to them. We want to make sure and leave time for all of your Q&A. And with that, I am going to go ahead and turn it over to Roger. And thank you again, and thank you all for taking time out of your day for this important conversation.
Great, thank you so much, Sarah Bell, and really appreciative of your support, as well as all the other funder leaders who originally hosted the previous session on good food purchasing back in March, and excited for this follow-up conversation with these very active leaders in the field who I've been blessed to be able to collaborate for many years now, and excited to be able to share their stories with you and all the potential success that has come from good food purchasing over the last few years. So thank you all. I want to welcome Alexa to the screen as well. So wanted to do a quick introduction of Alexa. Alexa is the executive director of the Center for Good Food Purchasing. She previously served as the managing director of the Los Angeles Food Policy Council from 2011 to 2015. And at the LA Food Policy Council, she spearheaded the development, launch, and implementation of the Good Food Purchasing Policy. From 2009 to 2010, she was the food policy coordinator for LA Food Policy Task Force, and working with the task force, developed with the mayor of Los Angeles, developed the Good Food for All agenda. Previously, Alexa worked for United Farm Workers and the San Francisco Board of Supervisors. Thanks for coming with us, Alexa. So we've been working together since 2015, when we originally in Chicago brought together our coalition in partnership with the Food Chain Workers Alliance, brought together a coalition of 30 partners who wanted to start advocating for the Good Food Purchasing Policy. And we originally did that during the mayor election that was going on in 2015. And after that election, we were able to work with, we got sign off from the mayor, and we were able to work with his team to start bringing good food purchasing to the city of Chicago. And you all were incredibly helpful for that process of doing the initial orientation, the kind of education of what it meant to be a member of the, to sign off on and commit to the pledge, as also the policy. And then all the technical assistance you guys have provided over the years as we've grown to expand to Cook County, hospitals and local healthcare institutions, and are looking at the state of Illinois. So welcome, Alexa. And we'll start with, could you share a bit of the history from your experience designing the original program, GFPP program in Los Angeles, to now the over 70 institutions that have enrolled?
Yes. Hi, everyone, and thanks for the introduction, Roger. For those who are maybe a little less familiar with the Good Food Purchasing Program, just briefly, it's a metric-driven framework and set of tools to ensure that our public dollars, excuse me, are invested in a food system that supports community values. So good jobs and workers' rights, the environment, regional producers and food businesses of color, high welfare standards for farm animals, and protection of the health of our children and communities. And like Roger alluded to, the origins of GFPP began when we were forming the Los Angeles Food Policy Council back in 2010, where I had the privilege of working with Claire Fox, Sustainable Ag and Food Systems Funders Executive Director. And we recognized, like most food policy councils do, that if we want to change a food system, it requires a coordinated effort with people working together across sectors, silos, and issue areas. And the way to bring people together is to co-create and really align around a common vision. So we anchored our shared vision to a framework that the W.K. Kellogg Foundation and its food and community grantees had developed. And it was the framework of good food, which they defined as food that's healthy, affordable, fair, and sustainable. And from there, the LA Food Policy Council developed what we called the Good Food for All agenda, which was a policy agenda organized around that framework, and it included a recommendation for the city of Los Angeles and the LA Unified School District to adopt a good food procurement policy. And we saw procurement as a key leverage point for building a more sustainable, equitable food system because of the billions of taxpayer dollars that are spent each year on food by public institutions. So that's schools, hospitals, carceral facilities, senior meals, and more. And we were also really inspired by procurement field leaders like the Real Food Challenge, School Food Focus, National Farm to School Network, and Healthcare Without Harm. So our focus became on translating this work into really an actionable and holistic policy framework that operationalized the term good food for public institutions. And over a 2-year process, we engaged hundreds of leading experts, both in Los Angeles and across the country, to help us articulate and translate into really specific criteria what that term good food might actually mean in practice. So we brought together experts in regional economics, labor, animal welfare, public health, environmental sustainability, major food buyers, producers, and many more. We developed what became known as the Good Food Purchasing Standards. And that was our roadmap for working towards our ideal food system. And it's sort of similar to LEED certification for green buildings in that institutions are expected to meet a basic minimum in each of 5 value categories and the principles of equity, transparency, and public accountability. And then we inspire institutions to improve their purchasing across these criteria over time. So in 2012, with leadership from the Mayor of Los Angeles, the City Council, the LA Unified School Board, along with a really robust cross-sector coalition that was led by the Food Policy Council and Joanne Lowe, who at that time was co-director of the Food Chain Workers Alliance and also one of the founding members of the LA Food Policy Council. The City of LA and the school district became the first institutions in the country to commit to GFPP. And like Roger alluded to, in 2015, there became a lot of interest in GFPP outside of LA. And that's when we created the Center for Good Food Purchasing to guide the national expansion. And then by 2016, thanks to some really masterful organizing and coalition building, we had coalitions by the Food Chain Workers Alliance. We had coalitions and institutions in Chicago with really amazing leadership from Roger, also in Oakland and San Francisco, California, Austin, and New York. And they, really took a chance on GFPP, and that leadership created incredible momentum nationally. So what started in LA with one city government, one school district is now a program that over 70 public institutions are a part of across 27 major cities. And altogether, these institutions, which encompass thousands of cafeterias and eating sites, spend over $1 billion a year on food and provide healthy meals to millions of students, patients, and other individuals. That's a little bit of the history.
Thanks, Alexa. And you were alluding to this at the end by talking about many of the national partners and partners on the ground who are essential for getting the program passed, adopted, and the ongoing years of work that it takes for full implementation and really start seeing the success on the ground for community members, partners, farmers, wholesalers. Can you talk a little bit more about the ecosystem of coalitions that are essential to make this possible?
Yeah, absolutely. So, and I imagine this is something that will be a recurring theme throughout our conversation, but really can't be overemphasized. And that is exactly that. This is really long-term, intensive, relationship-centered work that does require an ecosystem of cross-sector partners. So that includes leadership from operators within the institutions, policymakers and government staff at all levels of government, municipal, state, federal, engaged cross-sector grassroots coalitions and communities that really ensure that policy commitments made by our institutions actually lead to transparent supply chains and translate their commitments into actual change. And includes values-aligned food businesses and producers who are responsible for providing good food, and of course, funders. And we've been so fortunate to work in really deep partnership with many funders here today. And I think just, the headline is that the work and the fun really just begins once that policy is adopted, and then we get to work on implementation.
And just remembering the 2019 Power Procurement Conference that was held in Chicago that we're really excited to host, bringing together that full ecosystem of partners, and then also the federal procurement event that was in March, but really seeing the possibility and potential from bringing folks together. Any other follow-up thoughts on that?
No, I mean, I think it's been really the beauty of the work as it has evolved is that it's partnership focused. and it's nationally networked. And so when we're bringing together all of these different partners, the innovative models and policies that are being tested in one place can be adapted by partners in another, and coalitions in one place can be activated to support partners in another. And I imagine that Christina will talk a little bit about the really incredible hard-fought policy victory in New York that was led by the Good Food New York Coalition. And now we're seeing how these campaigns are building momentum that can then be replicated by other cities and really scale up and up to states and national and international levels. And we're seeing this with, like you mentioned, the Federal Good Food Purchasing Coalition that launched about 18 months ago. And there's a whole list of policy priorities, and one of those is part of that policy agenda is we're pursuing a state-by-state values-aligned incentive fund strategy that would increase the amount of public institutions receive to pay the true value of food. And this strategy provides both a replicable model for state campaigns and a necessary proof of concept for federal scaling. And so I feel like we've spent the last decade really building this beautiful ecosystem of partners, and we've laid a robust foundation, and we're just now at the point where we're really beginning to take the work to the next level.
Great, thanks so much, Alexa. Turning to Hailey. Welcome. Hailey Johnston is a Philadelphia-based father of 4 children who works to improve the vitality of rural and urban communities through food system reform. Along with his wife, Tatiana, he is the co-director and founder of The Common Market, a nonprofit distribution enterprise that connects communities to good food from sustainable family farms. Founded in Philadelphia to serve the mid-Atlantic states, the model has been replicated to serve communities and farmers in Georgia, Alabama, Texas, and now in Chicago. Hailey is a graduate of University of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania's Wharton School of Business, where he concentrated in entrepreneurial management. Welcome, Hailey.
Thanks.
Yeah, and so it's been great to get to know you and partner with you over the last few years. We met originally in New Orleans during the Wallace Center's ill-fated or infamous gathering right before COVID really took off in 2020. But it's been amazing to partner with you all as you brought in your model to the Chicago area of really supporting and emphasizing work with socially disadvantaged producers and really creating opportunities for them to get in the wholesale market chains that they wouldn't have access to otherwise. We've really started to see that potential start to flower in Chicago through some of the institutions we partner with, like the Juvenile Detention Center and the jail locally. So welcome. Can you start by speaking to the need to nurture, build, and grow equitable supply chains?
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you, Roger. It has been a pleasure getting to know you and partner with so many folks in Chicago. And most recently, I have to lift up, in addition to the Juvenile Detention Center, we have distributed throughout the entirety of the school district of Chicago, most recently serving of source identified single source farm fresh yogurt, which was a major victory. Yeah. So I think, equitable supply chains, and I think it's important to really begin with what inspired our work at the Common Market originally. And it had everything to do with food access and food sovereignty in vulnerable communities. And so the work that we do that Tatiana and I and a number of other community partners began more than 16 years ago in Philadelphia had everything to do with how we were seeing families in our own community, which is largely an African-American community in Philadelphia, really struggle to overcome generational poverty because of the impacts of chronic disease. Diabetes, heart disease, obesity, preventing people from participating in the workforce, preventing people from having successful educational careers. And what we saw is a lot of that chronic disease and conditions was informed by a lack of access to healthful food. And so for us, fundamentally, we saw that as a profound market failure, if you will, a failure of food systems to meet the needs of the most vulnerable people in society. And so what we began with is, fundamentally a question: if we weren't able to access good food in our own community, we wanted to understand why and how we could take greater sovereignty over that. Through that exploration, we also began to understand how family farmers in our region of Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, New Jersey were also struggling, and how they weren't able to get their product into markets at fair prices that recognize the care and intention that they brought to the work. And this is, a lot of this work precedes good food purchasing as it's formally defined now, but was very much inspired by the work of many other communities that were convened also by William K. Kellogg Foundation. And I have to shout out Linda Jo, because she's been a partner from the very beginning for us. And but seeing how these systems were not centering the needs of vulnerable communities on both the farmer and farm worker side, the environment, the supply chain, all the way through to food insecure communities, a lot of Black and brown and lower resource communities were being excluded and suffering as a result. And so what we saw from early on was a need to build relationships through food systems across supply chains that could bring about better outcomes for food producing communities and consumers. So the need continues to be profound, and not just for low income people, but I think really bringing good food and values driven food to all communities.
Thank you. And why is it challenging for producers to access most of these institutional supply chains?
Yeah, so, and we from the very beginning saw institutions as a place for need and possibility of reform, and sort of food system reform at a systems level, at a degree of scale that could bring about better outcomes for people and producers. When we were organizing, we saw that many people in our community, in our neighborhood of Strawberry Mansion in Philadelphia, were getting and in particular youth and families were getting significant percentage of their calories from schools, from hospitals, from other institutional settings. And we saw that as a perfect place to try to inform change and in part change in the quality of food that people could access, as well as create significant market opportunities. So at that point, many small mid-scale family farmers had almost no access to the institutional kitchen. And at that time, and still today, there are tremendous barriers to doing so, and everything from just fundamental understanding of wholesale readiness, the price points that institutions are willing to extend for food safety challenges, and a whole host of other barriers that were preventing farmers from participating. What we were seeing is that the only value that many of the institutions held, and in some cases, this is also a policy function, where decisions had to be made by lowest cost, right? And when lowest cost or lowest price is the only value that these that folks can use in making decisions in procurement, you end up with product that came about or is brought to an institution at a artificially low price, often informed by some form of exploitation or many forms of exploitation throughout the supply chain. So we saw that low cost and low price was like the enemy of good, and the enemy of good for farm workers, for animal welfare, and ultimately in the quality of food that was reaching our communities. So everything that we've done at the Common Market is to really think about how we overcome some of those obstacles and inform values beyond price as being critical to decisions for ecological health, for community health, for farm workers, and just broader community healing.
Yeah, thanks, Hallie. And thinking of that, and you brought up the concept when you were first starting to talk about market failures, and then starting to think about, with only lowest cost as the driver, that creates all these externalities, these negative impacts that we're having to pay through from society because we're not paying what we need to for food throughout, particularly in these institutional settings, to be able to magnify and amplify these other values. And one of the other ones that's really come up and is really part of the funding ecosystem a bit more is the focus and transition to really focusing on climate change and regenerative ag. Recognizing that's obviously an existential crisis and concern for all of us, but within the context of GFP's values-based procurement, entering in the supply chain, can you talk about what the importance is of not pivoting to only focusing on regenerative ag and climate change, but also how it fits within the larger toolkit and focus and potential from this more holistic way of operating?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think part of our focus, and I think what we've recognized as a need with food system reform is absolutely to consider the environmental externalities of agriculture, and in particular industrial or large scale corporate agriculture, and how that the negative impacts that's had on climate for generations now. But what we have also wanted to lift up through our work has been the many other negative externalities of large-scale agriculture, and the impacts that has on different communities. And so environment is a component of it. We're trying to lift up more restorative systems that consider externalities across a whole host of different communities. And when I think regenerative agriculture is the only focus. It's and for us, regenerative it transcends just an environmental context. It also considers the social impacts of production, right? So, and I think what you're getting at is like transcending just the environmental aspects of regenerative production and really lifting up and even centering in some cases the social impacts, and how food systems can be used for regenerative function across social impacts and communities as well. So for us, that includes thinking about who has been most marginalized through food systems throughout history, and how Black farmers, how socially disadvantaged growers, how women, how many communities have been negatively impacted through agriculture, and who are struggling to participate in more restorative opportunities, fair and transparent opportunities that are created by good food purchasing. And so a big part of what we've been trying to encourage is how we can create windows for participation and benefit across society that also include ecological benefit, but also really center the ability of communities of color and others to be new beneficiaries and leaders within food systems.
Thank you so much, Heidi. We'll pivot to Christina Spock. Hey, Christina.
Hey, Roger.
Quick introduction. Christina has 2 decades of experience in community organizing and advocating for racially equitable food policy. At Food Chain Workers Alliance, Christina provides direct campaign support to grassroots coalitions, leveraging public purchasing to protect food worker organizing and to hold food suppliers accountable for fair labor practices. She also serves on the boards of Heal Food Alliance and Food for the Spirit. Thanks for calling in today. So Christina, can you, sorry. So again, we've also been working since the beginning. You've been with Food Chain Workers Alliance since we started the organizing in 2015. and have been so incredibly helpful in being part of building the larger community nationally. All of the lessons shared across the many cities and partners, the exchanges that have taken place across different cities between Buffalo, Minneapolis, Chicago, Austin, LA, Boston, DC, New York, of course, with the recent success at the state level. So really appreciative of all that time and energy and community you guys have created over the years to really be supportive of the ongoing external work that is incredibly necessary for getting institutions to adopt and maintain and increase their participation in the programs. Thank you for all of that. I want to start with, can you share about how grassroots organizing is closely linked to the success in advocating for and ongoing support for good food purchasing policy change?
Yeah, thanks for the introduction and those kind words, Roger. It's so great to be working with you and all of our local coalition partners around the country. I'll just give a little bit of context for the Alliance and then kind of zoom out from there, if that's okay. Because for us, our starting place at Food Chain Workers Alliance has been around looking at how the food industry, for one, is the most exploitive, as we probably all know, right? And food workers are making the lowest wages of all workers in the US. And then also recognizing how a handful of corporations have near total control over our food system. Those are the same employers who retaliate against workers who exercise their right to organize, and the same ones who are getting paid by our tax dollars to supply food to our public schools and our public hospitals. And for us to ensure all food workers are free of that exploitation, we believe, our members believe, that we have to build worker power across every sector of the supply chain. And that's why Food Chain Workers Alliance was created a decade ago. Today, we're a bi-national coalition of 34 member organizations. These are independent unions and worker centers, and others supporting frontline worker organizing to improve those wages and working conditions. And actually, a founding strategy of the Alliance was leveraging procurement to protect workers, which is why we're part of building and expanding the Good Food Purchasing Program. So I'll just talk a little bit about that experience for us. As Alexa had mentioned, you know, the LA Food Policy Council, along with stakeholders and local organizers, really helped to build GFPP and begin working with the city of LA and LA School District to secure their long-term commitment. So like first and foremost, we see grassroots coalitions critical because they help to build GFPP. Those grassroots leaders in LA helped to draft legislation. They cultivated champions at the city council and the school board to ensure that the Good Food Purchasing Program would be applied to all food purchasing at the city and the school district. And shout out to Alexa, because as y'all know, she played a really important role in birthing GFPP too. And so these grassroots coalitions, like the one in LA and Chicago, right, have formed across the country and are really made up of folks that have expertise ranging across all 5 of those GFPP values that Alexa named. So these are community organizers, frontline food workers, labor leaders, farmers, policy advocates, public health officers, advocates for animal welfare and environmental sustainability. They are very dynamic partnerships. Another point is around how I think, we all know and recognize that grassroots organizing really grounds this work in the experiences of those most impacted. And so what does that mean for GFPP? Well, while public institutions play a really important role in values-based food purchasing, they can also be removed from the workers and the producers and the communities who are directly affected by the food served, and also by those workers within the institution's supply chain. So as we've seen, grassroots leadership is critical to ensuring that the experience and needs of those most impacted are centered, helping institutions stay accountable to local communities, and then also helping to build real outcomes that are felt by those folks on the ground. Another thing that we've recognized is that grassroots coalitions are the ones that are ushering policy to ensure long-term success. So policy is the means by which we ensure an institution's long-term participation in the Good Food Purchasing Program. And while institutions may support a good food purchasing policy, it's really the local coalition that has helped to facilitate this process of passage with local policymakers, and then also ensuring that it's the strongest version that gets passed, again, like we've seen in LA and Chicago. Typically that includes local policy, but more recently, as y'all referenced, this also has extended to state policy in New York and Illinois to lift barriers for agencies to be able to choose suppliers that's not just based on the lowest cost bidder. And so, yeah, just echoing the excitement and the appreciation for last week's passage of the Good Food and Why bill that does exactly that. I think another piece to lift up is that grassroots coalitions are also building very strong, dynamic partnerships that can hold public agencies accountable. So we can't just rely on the leadership of public agencies, just like we need our friends around us to hold us accountable to our commitments. We also we see the same thing applied here in our collective work. And at all points along the process, agencies really need community to hold them accountable to not just what is local and healthy, because that tends to be the values that are an easier fit, but also in what is fair, humane, sustainable, racially just. And the Center for Good Food Purchasing really plays an important role too in guiding those public institutions in that direction. So I think, for a decade now, the Food Chain Workers Alliance has supported amazing grassroots coalitions like y'all's in Chicago and across the country. Over a dozen grassroots coalitions that have passed a dozen policies and are working as close implementation and accountability partners for their public institutions. So right now, as part of what we call the Good Food Communities campaign, we're particularly working with frontline leaders, leaders who seek justice-oriented outcomes. So that's divesting from institutional suppliers that uphold and profit from a model of food production that's structurally racist and exploitive and unsustainable, and then at the same time investing in suppliers that advance racial equity and workers' rights and also supply chain transparency.
Thank you, Christina. Referencing back to the campaigns, we're in Chicago on our third mayor since we've gotten it adopted. And so I think some of the power of local coalitions is that recognizing that senior leadership is going to either change within an institution as administrators or as elected officials. So being able to have that continuity across different administrations to be able to hold them accountable and make sure that they know that even though it was their predecessor's priority and policy, it's still a priority for the community to maintain over time as well.
Yeah.
One other question before we jump into kind of group questions. How is labor vital for this conversation, for moving good food purchasing forward?
Yeah, thanks for this question, Roger. I think, now we have this landscape of grassroots dynamic coalitions that have passed policies and are continuing to do so. Yeah, we've really been exploring this question around what does GFPP mean for workers and what is the role of food workers in the Good Food Purchasing Program? And I think for us, when we talk about worker justice, we're also talking about racial and gender justice as well, because an overwhelming majority of the 24 million frontline food workers in the US are people of color, are women, are immigrants, and who are also at high risk of workplace retaliation, harassment, and injury. And while this food worker exploitation is often invisible to much of the public, it's also very rampant, unfortunately, in our public supply chains. So, public agencies can shift their purchasing so that they're not complicit in that exploitation, but are following the GFPP standards. And these standards get updated regularly by the Center for Good Food Purchasing based on learnings from those on the ground. And some of our members and certainly a lot of partners have been involved in writing and revising the fair labor standards. And a critical piece to that is that it requires that all vendors and suppliers respect workers' right to organize, including those workers who are not protected by that right federally. And why is protecting workers' right to organize important? It expands workers' ability to build power and autonomy over their own working conditions. So if we're going to address exploitation, we need those protections, and public food contracts can be a tool for holding employers accountable to respecting workers' rights. And there's also a role of food workers. So that's the investment that we have in GFPP, and seeing that as a critical tool for expanding protections. But also holding suppliers accountable requires that we listen to those who know workplace conditions best. And food workers aren't just witnesses to labor abuses, but they often are familiar with the business practices concerning other GFPP value categories as well, such as animal welfare and environmental sustainability. And their knowledge can help coalitions and institutions identify those violations that would otherwise not be known, and help to really inform and fill in the gaps for these some of these public supply chains, right? But in order to do that, workers really need to know if they're in these public supply chains, and public institutions need to hold suppliers accountable to fair labor practices and really take the lead from workers themselves who know workplaces and the employers best.
Thank you so much, Christina. So we're going to do a final quick round of questions, and then we'll open it up to the group questions. So, panelists, we try to keep the answers to 2 minutes. Keep it moving. So we'll start with Alexa. From your perspective, working with on-the-ground partners, institutions, and national coalitions, what supports would unlock the next phase of growth for GFPP and values-based procurement?
I'll keep it to 2 minutes. We could talk all day, but let's see, a few years ago, we released the Good Food Purchasing Roadmap, which lays out a vision and key strategies for a transformed food system by 2030, using procurement as the lever. We set out a goal that by 2030, a majority of public institutions are committed to and investing our taxpayer dollars in a transparent food system that supports the environment, health, equity, and well-being. And we know the goal is quite ambitious, and we also believe it's firmly within our reach because we've spent so long building with those on the line and so many, many others. And scaling up, really, the investments that are needed are in the full ecosystem of partners for the community-based coalitions that are essential to the work and are the laboratories of replication, for national partners who provide the backbone support and coordination to drive that acceleration, for the local and regional supply chain leaders and regional coordination to connect those efforts for bigger change, technology to make it easier for institutions to adopt values-based procurement, investments needed in the movement itself for partners focused on organizing and local, state, and federal policy advocacy. Also investment in the hard infrastructure, so producers and businesses are able to meet the demand for good food, and public institutions need more funding for meals that allow them to pay the true value of food. And when these efforts are really networked and amplified through good food aligned local, state, federal policy agendas, the aspirational 2030 goals become much more achievable. And just one last piece is that next year in 2025, the center turns 10, and we're really excited to use that anniversary as both a milestone and an organizing opportunity. And we'll be hosting a second Power Procurement Summit and use this time as really a visioning and strategic planning opportunity for that ecosystem of cross-sector partners to both celebrate what we've accomplished together, reflect on where we've been, what's working, what isn't, and get very specific about what it will take, the resources we need, and what we each commit to each other in order to reach those 2030 goals.
Awesome. Thanks, Alexa. I look forward to attending and celebrating 10 years with you next year. Thank you. Christina, from your work with worker centers, unions, and community coalitions, what is needed to unlock significant on-the-ground change for these communities?
Yeah, thanks. And also echoing excitement to be all together again soon. There are a couple of critical priorities that we've been collectively workshopping with other coalition partners, specifically around strategy and resources. So in terms of strategy, I think there's two big things that come up for all of us. One is enforcement, that institutions feel emboldened to create strategies and also consequences for suppliers who are violating the GFPP standards, and that there's staff who is responsible for enforcing those standards. The second is supplier transparency, which cuts across all of our work. And when we say supplier transparency, we mean both that the institution has access to sourcing data from their food contractors and subcontractors that traces all the way back to the farm, but also that the public has access to that supplier data too, because the absence of it really impedes community and worker involvement as informed partners in this work. And those strategies, we believe, won't likely happen without the support and the ongoing work of grassroots leadership. And so in terms of resources, we know that we need support for community and worker organizing that builds the strongest policies and practices, that's grounded in those that are most impacted, particularly those that are led by BIPOC folks. We know that we need to continue deepening our peer spaces where frontline leaders can learn from each other in real time. We know that we need supply chain research support that complements what the Center for Good Food Purchasing is doing, their analysis, and complements that ability to really reveal opportunities for strengthening impacts of GFPP. And then also just the capacity to publish our best thinking, our collective best thinking in real time, so that we can continue to be testing out creative strategies across our network as we're learning about them.
Thanks.
And I guess one other I'm sorry, Roger, just one other plug. Just want to call out that Food Chain Workers Alliance, Heal Food Alliance, and many other partners released a report with recommendations and potential strategies that we all think can help address some of these current challenges. I'll put the link in the chat. It's called Procuring Food Justice. And this report was written at the same time as the most recent GFPP standards were being revised. So there was hundreds of partners who were sharing their perspectives and best thinking, and it helped to inform both processes.
Great, thank you. Yeah, look forward to seeing that in the chat. It's an awesome resource for folks to be able to leverage. Hailey, from Common Markets' hard-earned experience partnering with farmers in 4 different and unique geographies, what resources are needed to dramatically scale up beneficial institutional procurement opportunities for Black and Brown producers?
Yeah, thanks, Roger. I'm going to double down on a couple of things that Christina and Alexa shared, and one, I would say supply chain transparency being critical to creating opportunities in general. 2, additional resources to actually pay the real cost or the true cost of food. We can't expect different procurement outcomes with the same procurement budgets, right? Real food grown with, produced with values that we're lifting up actually costs more money to deliver to community. And it needs to be recognized at a federal level, first and foremost, because it's federal budgets that inform the spending power of most of the institutions that we're referring to today. And then finally, I would say that what we see within procurement structures in general and food systems is that so much of the risk is borne by the farmer. And there isn't, even in places where GFPP is passed, in institutions where you have profound leadership commitment to values-based procurement, all of the power of procurement exists within those institutions and those leaders. All of the risk is borne by the farmers and other frontline communities. Until there's an opportunity for longer term commitments and extension of contracts and true partnership between procuring institutions and the people who are producing and processing that food, we don't get to real change because those folks cannot make affirmative decisions to invest in themselves, in their land, in their labor, without knowing that they actually have a real longer term commitment for their efforts. And so for us, those are the things that we're trying to encourage with the institutions where we partner is not just sort of one-off commitments or one-off showings of procurement and interest, but how do they plan with growers to build power and to create opportunities for investment over a longer time frame.
So a lot of key partnerships are intentional, ongoing. Deep partnerships between these institutions and producers is going to be a key piece of this work. All right, thank you all. So we've compiled the questions, thank you, Aaron, from the chat, and I'm going to divvy them up and at least have a point person if somebody else wants to chime in. We'll have about 15 minutes for this section. So, start here. I think this is a good one for Alexa to start with. Are the minimum requirements for institutions standard across the board? For instance, let's see the New York baseline sheet from the question, or are there different minimums based on the location of the institutions? A more technical question around GFCP.
I like the technical questions. I actually dropped a link to the standards in the chat. And the way that the standards work is that there is a minimum target that institutions enrolled in the Good Food Purchasing Program are expected to meet in each of the 5 value categories. But there is flexibility within that in terms of how they plan to meet that target. So for example, in the environmental sustainability category, there will point to, as one entry point, third-party certifications, and we've ranked the certifications with something like USDA organic or regenerative organic certification is sort of the gold standard, but there are other certifications that might be an easier lift for institutions to meet initially. So I guess to summarize, there is a target expected in each of the value categories.
But it does have the flexibility to allow an institution to start where they are, recognizing, as Kylie was talking about earlier, that most of these institutions who have adopted GFPP have never thought about or been held account to all these other standards and categories. So a lot of it's just learning, like what is, or at least in our experience has been, what does it mean to adopt these? Where are we at now? And then setting that as the floor for moving forward for ongoing success.
And one piece I would just add to that is when we do begin working with an institution, the first step that we take, in addition to collecting all their food purchasing data, we work with them on a baseline report. And I think often when an institution starts, they are concerned that they won't be able to that they won't score well in each of the value categories. But I think there's always this moment where they're like, oh, I was actually buying from a union farm and I had no idea, or food manufacturer. And so I think that transparency is both a really important tool for empowering the whole ecosystem of partners with information, but it's also can be really revealing that there are areas that or values that they were supporting that they had no idea. So it's a great learning opportunity always. And then from there, we set we set that pathway towards, gradually increasing.
Great, thanks, Alexa. I don't know if you have the generic, baseline assessment that you could share. I think it's so helpful to see the level of detail and comprehensiveness and suggestions. I think it's a really powerful tool. All right, moving on to the next question. I'm going to hand this. There's a few that are similar around funding and money for increments that pay farmers more. But I'm going to give this one the highly. What has been the impact of increased USDA funding in local and regional food systems, specifically the current programs, Local Food for School and the Local Food Procurement Program, LFPA?
Yeah, happy to speak to some of those programs. It's been, and I'll be super brief, it's been kind of remarkable, to be honest. In the 16 years of us playing this fulfillment role in aggregation and distribution and partnership with community, I've seen nothing more profound than what's been enabled by Local Food for Schools and LFPA, the Local Food Purchasing Assistance Program. In particular, because one, with the Local Food for Schools, it's provided the sort of unencumbered resources that schools actually need to make commitments to values categories, right? And so where schools are interested or even committed, without the additional resources, many have struggled to fulfill the potential of values commitments. So LFS has enabled schools to make longer-term planning commitments to farmers of color, to women ranchers, to regenerative products at price points that they could not afford previously. And the same is true with LFPA and LFPA, Local Food Purchasing Assistance, again, one where the intention is for commitments and longer-term commitments to be made to farmers of color and other socially disadvantaged growers, for that food to be distributed to food insecure communities. The longevity of those commitments being, up to 2 years long, really allows people to invest in themselves, invest in their land, invest in growth, invest in labor, and do things differently because they have firm and committed markets at fair price points. That they have never, quite literally, many of these growers have never had ever in generations of farming, right? To be able to have multi-year commitments for their product at fair price points has been game-changing. And it's allowed many partners to come in and unlock opportunities for access to capital and technical assistance and other infrastructure investments. And honestly, if there was any one thing or any several things that we could do to like really unlock all of this work, these additional kinds of resources and the longevity of commitment have been transformative for producer communities, as well as, again, right, the recipients of this product are typically lower income communities of color. So it's been nothing short of remarkable.
Yeah, I know in Illinois, we had our ups and downs of getting it going, but it's created a huge opportunity for many producers and folks in the middle who hadn't had access to these programs. There wasn't exclusively food banks, but it was many of the smaller scale food hubs and who are now having the opportunity to scale to meet this need. So recognizing that, this is a temporary program. It was the Biden's USDA that adopted it unilaterally, but there is an opportunity. There is a marker bill in the Senate, Ag Committee in their version of the bill, Farm Bill, that does include an extension in money for the LFPA program as well as LFS, just as something people could be thinking about as we're moving forward with the Farm Bill this year to make that a permanent program. All right, and we'll do our last question now. This one's for Christina. How do GFP coalitions and advocates with food purchasing navigate building support with either an elected government leader or funder who's only focused on one of the 5 values?
Yeah, well, I think that the work is multi-sectoral. So by supporting the Good Food Purchasing Program, they're supporting it all. So with all of the policies that have been passed, it includes all 5 values. And there's still other components to that around transparency, racial equity, and when you look at the baseline standards, it also is holding institutions accountable to all 5 values. So the same way that our coalition works as well. And Roger, if you, I'm curious if you want to chime in here at any point, but you know, the coalition, there might be some partners that are very passionate about one of the values, or that's just what their work is aligned around. But we all stick together, recognize how all of these values are interconnected, how our food system needs to be transformed, and you can't just transform one of those pieces, right? It has to all be one collective effort if we're really going to see transformation in the way that that is valuable and aligned. So I think that it's great if we you know, if there's an elected official or a funder who's really gung-ho about one particular value, that's awesome. And it opens the door for us to collectively address all 5.
Yeah, I think completely agree. I think it's incredibly powerful to hold the coalition together. As you said, you know, it is thinking about the 5 different values. They're all interlinked together. And that sometimes folks can have a desire for one, that's their priority, that's their passion, but really recognizing that if this coalition is going to succeed and meet its full potential, that they all have to come together. When things are trying to peel one off or be, oh, we're just going to go off in this direction, and this one's either it's the flavor of the month, it's sexier, it's the opportunity. You know, being able to hold this coalition and make sure that folks who are working on adopting standards are being as holistic as possible to really leverage the long-term change is incredibly important. We've just seen that happen. It's a constant thing where there's always new standards coming in that are emphasizing one, but not all. But how do those also get folded in, I think, is always going to be part of this longer-term conversation. We want to give much appreciation to all our panelists. Thank you so much for your time and energy and passion and work that you've done over many years. And excited to continue to partner with you all in the future. But wanted to hand it off to Linda Jo Doctor to give us a wrap up for the session today. Thank you.
Wow, give a wrap up. Hard to do with such extraordinary leaders that, you know, I think many of us are just in awe of the work that you do, and so appreciative for your leadership and partnership in moving this work. And I also want to add, just from the Kellogg Foundation, WK Kellogg Foundation, a pleasure to really co-host with SAFSF and with 11th Hour. I think and what's so phenomenal is we are seeing, you know, in front of our eyes, different aspects of the ecosystem in action. The connections between local, state, tribal, federal. I know we didn't spend a lot of time on tribal. We could do a whole nother webinar on food procurement within tribal nations and native communities because of different jurisdiction issues. But the connections, you know, we're seeing it play out in the comments and in the work that you all represent, and the connections of the demand side and the supply side. You got to do both. And that's been a learning in this. You've got to do both and pay attention to both and how they connect. The first webinar we focused, which was primarily focused on funders and funders sharing their perspective as to what brought funders to invest in this work. And while there are many, many pathways, I mean, for us through sustainable food production and equity, and also in the environment and health and just economy, there was general agreement that good food purchasing policies and practices are a key driver to transform the food system. And we heard about work at all levels and strategizing, organizing partnerships, building out an equitable supply chain, support for farmers, fair wages, protection for workers, distributors linked to institutions and hyperlocal systems, retail, new just economic models that are emerging from the field. We clearly saw the importance of infrastructure and movement building organizations and the importance to support at local, state, national levels and cross-tribal. I'm just going to add that. And we also heard about the importance of policies to create enabling environments, to hold communities, institutions, funders, all the players, be it government, business, nonprofit, and key institutions, to hold accountability. Lots of opportunity for funders to be able to support that work. We know from other work, funders supporting the local coalitions and organizing and building out the infrastructure, funders supporting the work statewide to move policy, to create the enabling environments. You know, there are about 18 states now that have some kind of local incentive purchasing opportunity at play. And while they might start out local, it's part of the building blocks to build out the additional values, but it's starting to socialize in the broader field the importance of these policies and practices. And of course, very exciting work happening on the national level. So again, lots of opportunities for funders to participate, to work in collaboration with the local, state, national, tribal-led groups that we're so fortunate to have to provide the leadership to really move the field. And in addition to that, a new fund called Growing Justice for Equitable Good Food Procurement that we hope in the future we'll be able to share in a future webinar, some more information about that as that starts to evolve. So again, thank you, everybody. And I think I now pass it on to Erin. Yes?
Yes, that's right, Linda Jo. Thank you so much. You did the impossible job of summarizing a lot of minutes between the two webinars of fantastic content from the funders that we heard from in March and from all of you. So thank you for that. So thanks again to all of our speakers, to Roger, Christina, Alexa, Hailey, and to Linda Jo and Sarah as our funder planning partners for supporting the conversation coming together today. Really just want to appreciate your time. I know that you all are very, very busy, so it means a lot that you're here. And I want to thank all of you, the funders, for showing up today and sharing your time with us. I hope that regardless of where you're at in your journey, whether you're deep involved in funding good food purchasing work or whether you're just learning about it today, that you're taking home something that will be helpful for you in your work. I wanted to mention that on this Thursday, June 20th, we are hosting an In the Kitchen call for our SAFSF members to really continue this conversation in a more informal funder-to-funder way, where we can reflect on this conversation and the conversation in March, digest as an opportunity to ask some more questions to your peers. So Maggie has dropped the link in the chat for registration, so please join us on Thursday at 2 p.m. Eastern Time.